On Monday, May 27, 1985, Oleg Gordievsky received a sudden directive to appear before senior officers of the KGB, the Soviet Union's most feared intelligence organization. Yet something about this summons instantly felt wrong. Instead of walking into a standard debriefing room inside headquarters, Gordievsky noticed he was being transported farther and farther away until the car stopped at a secluded residence inside a secure KGB compound. There, KGB General Viktor Grushko personally greeted him with food and Armenian brandy, insisting this was merely a relaxed conversation about intelligence matters. But underneath the pleasant facade, a trap had been carefully built. According to Ben McIntyre's book The Spy and the Traitor, Gordievsky's glass had been secretly dosed with a chemical called SP-117, an experimental truth serum engineered to weaken resistance and force confessions from suspected traitors. As he sat at the table, his vision began warping and hallucinatory flashes crept into his mind. He knew something was happening to him, but before he could fully process it, two interrogators entered. "We know you are working for the British. We possess undeniable proof of your treachery. Admit it. Now, Prisnazia." Gordievsky felt his body trembling, yet he defied them. "No, I have nothing to admit." For 5 exhausting hours, drenched in sweat, he repeated one thought: never confess. That phrase had once been preached by Kim Philby, the legendary British defector who served Moscow and escaped accountability. Philby had taught that denial was the ultimate shield. Reject, reject, reject. Gordievsky said later that this reflex became instinctual. He denied even as his mind blurred. But ironically, the KGB's underlying suspicions were accurate. Oleg Gordievsky actually was a double agent. For almost 10 years he had been quietly delivering secrets to MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence service, during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Secrets that arguably helped prevent nuclear Armageddon. During a major NATO military exercise, the Soviets believed a simulated Western attack was actually a real nuclear strike being prepared. They began moving missiles into readiness, fearing NATO intended a first strike. Gordievsky urgently informed London of the immense misunderstanding, allowing Western leaders to lower their posture and avoid escalating toward a genuine nuclear conflict. Many historians now believe his warning may have prevented a catastrophic Third World War. 2 years after that life-saving alert, Soviet counterintelligence began turning its focus toward him. Suspicion thickened around his movements, and eventually he found himself trapped inside Soviet borders. If the KGB confirmed their doubts, execution was not only likely, it was routine. Unless he somehow pulled off the impossible. Mi-6 already had a plan in mind. A near unthinkable extraction mission that would sneak him out of the USSR, hidden inside the trunk of a diplomatic vehicle. More details of that daring rescue appear later in this story, but first, it is vital to understand why Gordievsky was vulnerable in the first place. His connection to the KGB began long before his intelligence career. The agency ran through his family line. His father, Anton, had been a proud KGB officer who treated the role almost like a hereditary calling. He even wore his KGB uniform on weekends. Young Oleg trained at the elite Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the Soviet equivalent of Harvard, before he joined the organization in the early 1960s. Yet 3 specific events slowly shook his belief in the Soviet system he was trained to defend. The first occurred in 1961, when he witnessed the sudden rise of the Berlin Wall. Although Berlin lay inside East Germany, its western districts remained under Western authority. Gordievsky watched as East Germany constructed the wall not to prevent enemies from entering, but to prevent its own population from escaping to freedom. The moment deeply unsettled him. The second gradual turning point surfaced during his assignment to Denmark, where he supervised covert Soviet networks and reported back to Moscow. Copenhagen's openness and prosperity contrasted so sharply with the restrictions of Soviet life that Gordievsky began re-evaluating beliefs he once held sacred. He wandered freely, breathed the air of Western culture, studied Danish society, and even bought gay magazines simply because, unlike in the USSR, nobody would punish him for it. Gordievsky later explained that it wasn't about sexuality. It was about the exhilaration of choice. He told author Ben McIntyre that being in Denmark allowed him to blossom as a person, and that every moment of Danish freedom reminded him the Soviet Union resembled a vast, stagnant prison. This personal awakening, however, did little to improve his strained marriage. His wife, Yelena, who hoped to become a German language instructor, remained emotionally distant. It was marriage engineered for bureaucratic reasons more than affection. KGB officers were rarely permitted foreign postings without being married, a policy intended to reduce susceptibility to persuasion or romantic entanglements abroad. Gordievsky simply wanted the overseas assignment. Then came the third and most devastating disillusionment. In August 1968, when the Soviet military sent more than 2,000 tanks into Prague to crush the Czechoslovak reform movement, Gordievsky felt disgusted. He later described the scene as a brutal assault on innocent citizens, one that ignited inside him a fiery hatred of the communist structure he had once defended. By 1970, Soviet intelligence recalled him to Moscow, suspecting correctly that Danish authorities had grown suspicious of him. He returned deeply unhappy, not only because he despised bureaucratic work, but because Moscow itself felt dreary and repressive. McIntyre famously described the city's atmosphere as reeking of boiled cabbage and clogged drains. Gordievsky agreed. It symbolized everything the Soviet system had turned into. 2 years into that dreary existence, fate intervened. Several suspected Soviet spies were expelled from Denmark, leaving the KGB urgently in need of a Danish-speaking officer. Gordievsky was sent back in 1972. That return did not go unnoticed. MI6 made its first careful move by sending Standa Kaplan, an old acquaintance who had defected to the West years earlier, to knock on Gordievsky's front door. The two met for a friendly lunch and reminisced about university days. But beneath the small talk, Kaplan was evaluating whether Gordievsky could be persuaded to cooperate. Gordievsky later admitted that he sensed the hidden purpose behind the meeting and felt as if he were standing on the edge of an abyss. The next step came from Richard Bromhead, MI6's station chief in Copenhagen. He quietly monitored Gordievsky's badminton club until he could casually introduce himself and invite him to lunch. Months later, during another meeting, Gordievsky made his position unmistakably clear. "No one knows I am speaking with you." That simple phrase represented an irreversible turning point. Oleg Gordievsky had officially crossed sides. Unlike many Cold War defectors, Gordievsky refused financial compensation at first. Money was not the reason he turned against the Soviet Union. He genuinely believed the Kremlin's ideology was corrupt. Former MI6 officer Baroness Margaret Ramsay later explained that Gordievsky simply understood the Soviet system was a lie. In time, he assisted British intelligence in identifying multiple Soviet agents in Western governments. 1. Gunvor Havik worked inside Norway's foreign ministry and had been blackmailed after a wartime romance with a Soviet captive. She spent almost 30 years fulfilling KGB demands. Another, Arne Treholt, a senior Norwegian diplomat, claimed he was coerced with compromising photographs taken during an orgy. Meanwhile, Gordievsky began a romantic involvement with Laila Alieva, a younger woman employed at the World Health Organization. Their relationship grew while his marriage to Yelena collapsed. When the KGB, skeptical of divorce, recalled him again to Moscow, he eventually married Laila. That decision would later dictate the most painful sacrifice of his life. When Gordievsky returned to Moscow, MI6 deliberately cut all contact with him. Any attempt to reach him could expose their connection, so British intelligence opted to wait. Before leaving Denmark, Gordievsky had asked MI6 to establish a covert escape plan in case things ever turned dangerous. The idea was simple yet ingenious. If he ever needed extraction, he would stand outside a certain bakery on a Tuesday evening at 7:30 p.m., holding a Safeway grocery bag. An MI6 officer would walk by eating a Mars bar while carrying a green Harrods shopping bag, proof that the escape route was active. Much of the operation was organized by Valerie Petit, a 48-year-old MI6 officer renowned for her precision, quick judgment, and calm manner. The rescue mission received the codename Pimlico, and its blueprint involved moving Gordievsky from Moscow toward Finland, then hiding him in the trunk of a British diplomatic vehicle. Few escape plans in espionage history sounded more impossible, yet eventually the plan would be tested under extreme pressure. After remaining under suspicion for several years, Gordievsky worked relentlessly to rebuild his political standing. His domestic life seemed stable now that he had 2 young daughters, and eventually Soviet superiors granted him another foreign posting. This time, in 1982, he was sent to the United Kingdom, the very location he and MI6 wanted most. He had impressed Russian leadership by completing a demanding 4-year English course in just 2 years, demonstrating language mastery and political awareness. MI6 quietly celebrated his assignment and even engineered the expulsion of his direct boss, Igor Titov, so Gordievsky could rise in rank faster. Within months, he became deputy head of political intelligence in London, eventually reaching lieutenant colonel. Once installed inside the KGB's London station, Gordievsky provided intelligence that dramatically shifted Western understanding of Moscow's thinking. In 1981, KGB Director Yuri Andropov warned Soviet officers that the United States was preparing a nuclear strike, a terrifying assertion grounded more in fear than in evidence. Soviet intelligence misread tiny details: late-night office lights inside government buildings, crowded parking lots at the Pentagon, even increasing blood donations, interpreting everything as preparations for nuclear war. President Reagan's harsh rhetoric amplified those worries. When he called the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world, Kremlin leaders feared the West was preparing to destroy them. Then, in November 1983, NATO held Able Archer, a large-scale simulation designed to rehearse nuclear escalation. The Soviets misinterpreted the exercise as a possible prelude to a genuine U.S. first strike, and their forces prepared nuclear bombers with real warheads. The world came dangerously close to nuclear disaster without either side fully comprehending how close they were. Gordievsky urgently notified MI6 that Soviet leaders believed NATO intended to attack. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher immediately recognized the monumental importance of this warning. Gordievsky was giving the West an unobstructed glimpse into the psychology of Kremlin leaders. She argued that the West had to act quickly to reduce Soviet fear. MI6 passed the intelligence to the CIA, and President Reagan altered his tone, choosing more conciliatory language and opening additional channels of communication with Moscow. That measured approach helped lead to the INF Treaty, the first major agreement reducing nuclear arsenals held by both superpowers. Gordievsky, in turn, became instrumental in easing Cold War tensions and helping the world step back from a nuclear edge. Only a handful of individuals knew his true identity, reportedly just 8 people, including select CIA officers. One of those was Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA officer responsible for Soviet counterintelligence. Instead of protecting U.S. assets, Ames betrayed them, secretly selling America's most sensitive secrets to Moscow for millions of dollars. Numerous CIA sources working inside the KGB were exposed and executed because of his treachery. One of the secrets Ames sold was Gordievsky's cooperation with MI6. That single revelation would change everything. Yet as investigators followed the final trail left behind in scattered archives and faded case files, the deeper implications of this operation continued to resurface long after the headlines disappeared. Intelligence agencies gradually admitted that several actions taken in the following decade were shaped directly by what this network had accomplished. Nations reevaluated their assumptions about insider loyalty, data protection protocols, and even the broader philosophy of security. But perhaps the most unsettling realization was that the network had exploited not only classified information, but the blind trust institutions had in their own guardians. Even now, cybersecurity analysts point to this incident as an era-defining lesson. The real threat was never only foreign infiltration. It was that the system never imagined someone inside could willingly provide the keys. Military departments rewrote entire handling procedures, requiring segmented access, rotational clearances, and psychological evaluations that would have seemed excessive only years earlier. Because the bitter truth was already carved into the post-incident landscape. The moment insiders discover they can quietly move information that shapes geopolitics, prevention becomes far more complex than simply defending against foreign attackers. As some former officials later admitted in carefully worded interviews, they suspected for years that someone had orchestrated a channel far more coordinated than authorities publicly acknowledged. Yet political pressures and diplomatic sensitivity kept these suspicions behind closed doors. After all, admitting the full extent of what had been leaked might have forced governments to confront uncomfortable strategic miscalculations. The world continued forward, but it did so with an unspoken awareness that the past had not been entirely resolved. In several classified review boards, the question shifted from "how did this happen?" to a more unnerving concern: how many others like him might still exist? With every declassified document, that possibility gained weight. Some files hinted that additional figures had operated parallel to the main subject, never confirmed, never captured, but strongly suggested by fragmented communications and encrypted references. Intelligence historians debate these possibilities to this day, proposing that what appeared to be a singular betrayal may in fact have been part of a much broader campaign, one that relied on multiple points of access, distributed across different institutions. But while agencies expanded their technical defenses, one core element remained difficult to neutralize: ideology. The person at the center of this narrative did not view himself merely as a spy or traitor. In his own writings, he framed his actions as a necessary response to global imbalance, believing that parity between great powers was the only way to prevent catastrophic escalation. To him, providing access to classified material was a form of geopolitical correction, not disloyalty. Whether this belief was sincere conviction or rationalization remains endlessly debated, but what is undeniable is that this mentality turned him into one of the most consequential figures of the era. Years after the trial and the official closure of the case, journalists attempted to interview surviving participants, hoping to uncover personal motives or emotional reflections. Most declined. A few responded in carefully scripted statements, repeating familiar lines about duty, obligation, or regret, yet offering little true insight. The main subject himself rarely offered explanation beyond philosophical remarks that seemed detached from the human consequences of his decisions. He spoke about deterrence, balance, and the fragility of power, without acknowledging how many lives were altered by the information he delivered. Ironically, as decades passed, public interest shifted. Younger generations encountered this story through documentaries and digital analyses rather than memory. To them, he became less a living participant and more a symbol of betrayal to some, of moral defiance to others. Academic circles dissected his motives, while intelligence communities focused on operational methodology. The deeper human dimension gradually faded beneath layers of interpretation, turning him into a complex historical puzzle rather than a person. But if one lesson survived the noise, it was that national security is never a finished achievement. Even the strongest fortifications can be dismantled from within by someone who believes they serve a higher purpose. Modern defense strategies now emphasize behavioral analytics, insider threat monitoring, and psychological resilience, not merely encryption or classified clearance. Because the danger exposed by this case was not only technical, it was fundamentally human. In the end, no official statement ever captured the full truth of what had unfolded. The most revealing details remained buried in intelligence vaults, accessible only to a select few. Yet the legacy of this story endures in every defensive system built since, every classified document that requires multiple authorizations, and every quietly monitored insider whose sudden shift in ideology might signal a threat no firewall could ever predict. And perhaps that is the unsettling conclusion. History remembers the names, but institutions remember the vulnerabilities. Thanks for watching.